Hey, that was a nice little glitch. Hello, everybody. We're delighted to be here. I'm thrilled. I'm Anthony Flacavena with my Ruby partners, Erica Edelson and Cynthia Wallace. And thanks so much to Rachel and Tricia and the Indivisible folks for making this opportunity for us. We have a lot of content. Just to reiterate what Rachel said, tonight is the first of two parts. It's very distinct. Next Wednesday, will be entirely different. Tonight, we're focused on the problem, the underlying causes of the divide as we have come to understand them. And next week, we will focus on what we can do about it. And all three of us will be back at that point to work with you. We have about 35-ish minutes of presentation and then an equal or greater amount of time for discussion. So we're really looking forward to it. A very quick word about Ruby. We're less than a year old, but we formed because we recognize that we need rural America, both to win elections and to have a functioning society and economy, and that we were losing rural America in a steady process over the last couple of decades or more. So we have created Ruby to try to understand why that is and what we can do about it. And we would love for you to visit our website to learn about what we do beyond this training. So tonight, we're going to talk to you about the divide. And we're going to start with a few slides that are kind of context. And the first comes from Heather McGhee in her book, The Sum of Us, where she says the plutocrats have always known that solidarity is the answer, that the sum of us can accomplish far more than just some of us. That's why the forces seeking to keep the economic rules exactly as they are aim to cut off any sense of empathy white people who are struggling might develop for also struggling people of color. And isn't that kind of the essence of the challenge that we face, that lack of empathy? Second little caveat is to say that we completely recognize from our own experience that rural communities are not all white. Some rural communities, like where I am in Appalachia, are certainly predominantly white, but many rural communities have significant and growing populations of immigrants and of people of color. And also that the working class, as we've come to call it, is not all the same. Even among the white working class, as Karen Nussbaum has said from Working America, what we found is that 1/3 of the people we talk to are already with us. 1/3 will never be with us. Working America, therefore, concentrates its organizing efforts on the 1/3 in the middle that are open to persuasion. And this group in the middle among the working class, Andrew Levison has kind of differentiated into two categories, what he calls extremists. Those would be the people that there's no hope of us reaching them, and cultural traditionalists, which are more salt of the earth rural people with more traditional values, but people who are open to a different politics and different ideas. So we have to recognize these things. Let's jump into how we got here. We're going to walk through, this will be the rest of the presentation, the 5 underlying causes of the divide. And I'll start us off and be joined in a bit by Cynthia and then Erica. The first and really the foundation of the divide is that the economy just has not worked for most Americans. We talk a lot about the top 1%. In fact, the top 20% of wage earners have really done pretty well over the last 40 years. But everybody else, 80% of us, have suffered from either stagnant wages or job loss. Probably the most important feature of all is this incredible economic insecurity, the sense that you don't know if your job's going to last, if you'll be downsized, you're in debt, you're not sure if you can pay off your debt. So this economic insecurity has been particularly acute in communities of color and in rural communities. We have an economy that Ronald Reagan characterized as a trickle-down economy, and unfortunately, both parties have tended to follow that paradigm. But in fact, the notion that wealth will trickle down to the rest of us if we just free up the investors and the uber entrepreneurs, well, that's been not only false, it's the exact opposite. In fact, our economy is a suck-up economy. It has sucked up wealth from workers to the owners of capital, from Black households to white, from small businesses and family farms to the small group of giant corporations from Main Street to Wall Street and from rural communities to urban. And this concentration of wealth isn't recent. It's been going on for 40 years. Now, Trump and his Tax Cuts and Job Act made it far worse with huge drops in the top income tax rate and the corporate tax rate. But the truth is that even through 16 years of Democratic presidents, we've seen a steady concentration of income, wealth, and political power. Now, we at Ruby absolutely do not equate the two parties as being the same or practically indistinguishable. That is nonsense. But we also believe that we have to own our own role in this mess, because we and our leaders have not only allowed the Republicans to get away with some terrible stuff, but in fact have led the charge on some things. Bill Clinton worked with Republican members of Congress and a few Democrats to eliminate the Glass-Steagall Act, and that was one of the most critical steps in freeing up Wall Street to basically pilch wealth from the rest of us. And during 8 years of President Obama's administration, you might recall that he tried to take on the monopolies in agriculture, particularly meat processors, because of how they are screwing small contract farmers. But his staff ultimately let that go, and virtually all mergers and political power corporate power went unchallenged. So this concentration of wealth and power, this monopolization that has been ongoing now since the early 70s, it harms the whole economy. It harms all workers, but it is especially hard on rural communities, because rural communities are much more likely to depend on one or two big employers or one or two industries. And because of that economic lack of diversity in most rural places, the influence of a corporate power like Tyson is far greater than you would see in an urban area. But it isn't just ag. In fact, most of the typical traditional rural-based industries have been in steady decline now for somewhere between 30 and 40 years. The timber industry in the Pacific Northwest and parts of Appalachia, coal mining in Appalachia and Illinois and the Navajo Nation, and in places like North Carolina, South Carolina, and Southern Virginia, scores and scores of small manufacturers making furniture, textiles, et cetera, have been offshored. This concentration of wealth, we could quote so many statistics, but one comes from the Rust Belt states in the Midwest, the industrial Midwest, where right now, more than half of all counties in the industrial Midwest have a lower median household income than they did in 1980, 42 years ago. That's extraordinary. Farmer debt relative to income is higher today than it's been since the 90s, and job loss due to NAFTA, instead of creating jobs, as likely approaches 500,000. This economic neglect, this extraction of wealth from everyday businesses, family farms, and rural people has led to this sense, very widespread, of neglect and betrayal. And that has cultivated what we see now very strongly, which is a sort of virulent anti-elitism. It's based on that economic decline and the sense of betrayal. Unfortunately, the right, as they do so well, have managed to define who the elites are, and they're less the plutocrats than they are city folks, liberals and Dems, progressives, environmentalists, intellectuals. This is who has been defined in the minds of many working folks and countryside people as the elites. And it's fostered what Kathy Kramer, another founder member of Ruby, calls a politics of resentment. Kathy, who spent a better part of 5 years visiting with people throughout about 24 different rural communities in Wisconsin, found that there was a strong rural consciousness. Some of that was, again, this sense of neglect and anti-elitism, the sense that they weren't getting their fair share, that resources, money, and decision-making all goes to the cities, not the countryside. Now, that's not entirely true, of course, but that's the strong sense. There's also a positive dimension to this rural consciousness, which is an identity that people have to their place, a connection to their town, their community, their region, far stronger than suburban and urban inhabitants tend to have. Kathy, in her book, The Politics of Resentment, talks about the intersection between race, racism, and this anti-elitism. And she says we're failing to understand the perspectives of rural people when we assume that racism is more fundamental than calculations of injustice. The two elements are intertwined. The way these folks described the world to me, their basic concern was that people like them in places like theirs were overlooked and disrespected. Another element of this anti-elitism that's kind of bedeviling us on the liberal progressive side is the view of experts. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard my liberal friends say, what is wrong with these people? Why won't they listen to the experts? Well, again, part of the reason is Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity and the right-wing media machine. But it's also the case that the experts aren't always right. Bill Clinton and Robert Rubin, as Treasury Secretary, said that NAFTA would create 1 million new jobs, net new jobs over 5 years. And in fact, NAFTA did not. And in rural places and small towns, it had precisely the opposite impact. Gwen Johnson, who lives in Eastern Kentucky, right across the mountain from me, she was talking to a gentleman from Massachusetts who said, Gwen, I don't understand. Why won't people in your area get vaccinated for the pandemic? And she said, OxyContin. We were told it was perfectly safe and not addictive. The doctors, the pharmacists told us this, and the government regulators said it was okay. Yet it devastated our communities. So some folks don't trust the experts on vaccines either. The point is that the anti-expertise is not entirely irrational. There are reasons that people have for being skeptical. One more element of this rural consciousness, and Kathy and other authors have looked very close at this, is the critical role of work in rural communities, that it's very much esteemed and it's very much in the definition of people's identity of themselves, that hard work is highly valued, something people are proud of. I've heard an author from Harvard describe working class jobs across the board as gloomy, and yet countless people, whether they're farming or construction workers or foresters, they take pride in their work. They believe in it, and they believe that they're not only providing for their family, but that they're making a contribution to their community and the nation. We, on the other hand, probably a lot of us also believe that, but too often the liberal focus is looking at the downside of work, promoting ideas that basically say work is really either a problem or shouldn't be an issue. This has created a third underlying cause, which is a strong resistance to the government in general, but specifically regulations, and really across the board regulations, but more than anything else, environmental regulations. Now, this is a terrible and unfortunate irony because rural people's lives, whether they're farming or fishing or timbering or countless other things, are really more dependent on a healthy ecosystem, more directly dependent on a functioning ecosystem than lives for people in the city and suburbs. Of course, we all depend on a healthy ecosystem, but rural people tend to have the occupations and livelihoods that really depend on it. And yet, many have developed this regulatory aversion. Now, where does this come from? A lot of reasons for it. We'll mention a couple. One is that, again, sometimes regulations don't do what they're supposed to. 12 years ago, 29 miners in southern West Virginia were blown up, killed at the Upper Big Branch mine. That A.T. Massey mine was cited for safety violations over 500 times in the year before the explosion, more than 50 times in the month before the explosion, but nothing of substance changed. All these miners were killed, their families and community devastated. So it's a little bit understandable why people would be skeptical about whether regulations really work. And another dimension is that too often, and I've seen this in my own work, and Kathy Kramer cites it in her research, too often farmers, fishermen, foresters, small business owners, and others who are real innovators in rural communities are completely overlooked and dissed by the experts. This fellow, Bren Smith, brilliant guy who quit high school at 15, was a commercial fisherman for 25 years, and has now created a phenomenal system to raise shellfish, sequester huge amounts of carbon, and clean up the marine ecosystem. Nobody came to Bren for his expertise. And yet this is the kind of thing that's out there. And when it's overlooked, people begin to distrust the experts. The fourth cause is what Arlie Hochschild has called in her book, feeling like strangers in their own land. Much like Kathy Kramer in Wisconsin, Arlie spent several years with rural Louisianans to try to understand them, their priorities and values, and their voting patterns. And what she found was that it was very common sense of feeling like they're being displaced or passed by, the sense that they've been waiting in line, that they've been doing the right thing, working hard, playing by the rules, all those kinds of stuff, and yet they're getting nowhere. They're maybe even falling further back in line. Now, what the right has managed to do is to help them point the finger at immigrants, at women, at people of color, to blame the wrong people. But the sense of being stuck in line and making no progress is real, and it's legitimate, and it has fueled this sense of outrage and grievance. In a study done, it was actually extensive focus groups that was done by the Democracy Corps in 2021. They were focused on conservative rural people and their views of the world. And Andrew Levison, in summarizing some of that research, said that, for Democrats and liberals more broadly, we envision a progressive future America as being exciting, culturally and ethnically diverse, multiracial country in which there's general tolerance for diversity. But these white working class and small town people in these studies imagined instead an elitist society emerging, a society in which they have no place. And Levison says to understand why they might feel that way, you only have to look at how they are portrayed, their communities, their towns, their livelihoods, manual labor and other elements of it, which is so often either neglected or disregarded and disrespected in the general culture and media. Now, we're moving towards kind of our own place in this now. There's a lot of factors behind this divide. The fifth underlying cause is exactly what we have done to either enable it or even exacerbate it. So Larry Summers, who played a key role in both the Clinton and Obama administrations, he was asked about this question of why so many working class folks in rural and small towns were leaving the Democratic Party. And he admitted that they never visited Rust Belt cities that had been devastated by NAFTA, a policy that was passed by Bill Clinton. Displaced white workers, Summers said, weren't heavily on our radar screen. So he's admitting right there that the Democratic Party just basically decided they weren't important. And the other element of this shift in the party is this movement away from the working class towards a party of what Thomas Frank has called the professional class. Another way that some authors have looked at this is that we've embraced in a way far beyond what we ever have before, the idea of meritocracy. Now, we could debate the pros and cons of meritocracy, but it's clear that our top leaders have become, over the last 20 or so years, far more comfortable with the richest, the best educated, the people of the most elite people in economics, entrepreneurship, and education. And that this location of the Democratic Party as a party among the elites has been picked up by working folks. We've become, in a sense, more liberal on social issues, which I'm happy for and something that was long overdue, but more neoliberal on economic issues, more aligned with kind of historic Republican position, an embrace of investor-driven trade policies, of trickle-down economics and other things. And so neither party has done much of anything to help the working class and farmers and rural communities. But one party, the other one, speaks to these working class concerns and the anger, while we've tended to focus elsewhere. And what the result has been is that we have been hemorrhaging support in rural areas. In my state of Virginia, we just lost the governorship and all the top statewide offices in the 2021 election. Compared to 10 years ago, we went from 4 counties that voted 70% or more for the top Republican on the ticket to 44 counties, an 11-fold increase. And it isn't just Virginia. Across all working class voters, support for Democrats has slipped steadily since 2008, down to just 33%. And when you realize just what a large percentage of the electorate the working class makes up, you can't win significant elections without that. And even among working class voters of color, Democrats have steadily lost support. And it's at this point that I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Cynthia Wallace, who is the co-founder and director of New Rural Project in North Carolina, a great addition to Ruby, and like me, a former candidate for Congress in her part of North Carolina. Cynthia.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Can y'all hear me? All right, awesome. Well, it is a pleasure to be here with you all, especially Rural Indivisible Caucus. We thank you all for hosting this, and it is just an honor to share space with my friends. We just realized earlier tonight that Eric and I met on a Rural Indivisible call almost 1 year ago. So it's just a pleasure. And as Anthony mentioned, I'm the executive director of the New Rural Project. And as I mentioned, we were really excited to share our brand new organization that I co-founded with Helen Prost Mills here in North Carolina at a Rural Indivisible Caucus meeting in July of last year, when we were really only 3 months old. And our organization is, I think Anthony talked a lot about the working class, and a lot of that research has been more on the, kind of the Midwest. I think a lot of that research is in focus where there probably isn't the amount of folks of color like there are in the South. But that's where we're headquartered and where we focus. And what we have seen is a major decrease in the engagement of folks who have been historically marginalized, in particular African American, Hispanic, Native American, and AAPI folks in the South, and how that historical marginalization has actually led to reduction in their civic and electoral engagement. And that's where we come in. We are focused on increasing that civic and electoral engagement and working with other like-minded organizations and individuals to break down the barriers that have helped to reduce their engagement. So I do kind of go into a lot of the numbers, so we're going to go into that. And we start our work really focused on doing this work not at election time, not 2 months before election day, but really 365 days a year involved in these counties and with our rural friends and neighbors. And so we started our work in those 7 counties. You'll see they're highlighted in green. They border South Carolina. And since last year when we got started, we've had an opportunity to work on the ground, talking to these infrequent voters with friends like our Indivisible ID9 group, to do our front porch conversations, our deep canvassing, as well as to launch our new barbershop series. I'm not going to talk about that today. What I am going to talk about is a little bit more about the numbers and what we're actually seeing on the ground as it relates to these partisan shifts and those kind of things that have been happening over the last 12 years. All right, there we go. So what I'll talk about on this slide is a little bit about what we've seen happening in this shift of how people recognize themselves as a party. So in this first chart, I always like to kind of ground you. There are a few numbers. So these are my, what I call my Pac-Man charts or our pie charts that looks at those 7 counties that I talked about where we do our focus, many of which, as Anthony also rightly talked about at the beginning, are also very diverse places. Of these counties are 7, 4 of the 7 are actually already major majority minority counties. And so our focus there really gives us an opportunity to have a deep lens on that part of the rural and urban divide. And so as you can see, hopefully gave you a second to kind of adjust your eyes to these 4 pie charts. What these represent is what the party affiliation how it has changed from presidential election, the last 4 from 2008 to 2020. So in each of these circles, the blue represents the percentage of those folks who are registered Democrats. The red represent the percentage of that demographic in that presidential election year that were registered as Republican. And then the green are unaffiliated, which is North Carolina's version of independent. So as we can see, if you just visually look at from 2008 and 2012, those were, as we know, the elections where Obama was on the ballot. 2016 is when Trump was on the ballot. In our white voters, no surprise, that red has gotten larger in these rural counties. Now you got about 46% that now look at themselves and are registered as Republican. But what has significantly increased has been those folks who are registering as unaffiliated. And that is all at the expense of people being registered as Democrats. So same charts looking at our Black voters. Once again, really no surprise here. African Americans are still predominantly registered as Democrats, though you have seen that take a slide. But you also, in the same intervening 12 years, you've seen their support of being registered as Republicans has actually gone down just a little bit. But the major lift has also, once again, been in our unaffiliated population. And if we were looking at this graph and only looking at voters under 40, you would see a dramatic shift in the number of unaffiliated African American registered voters in these rural counties that now don't connect to either party. So now these pages might be a little bit of surprise. I don't know how much you know about this part of North Carolina, but in these 7 counties, the third largest minority population is actually Lumbee. In Robinson County, you'll see, if you look from left to right from 2008 to 2020, a 24-point reduction in the Native Americans in these 7 counties that register themselves as Democrat. That shift has happened not only to unaffiliated voter, which has gone up from 13% to almost 30% of their population, but a doubling of those Native American registered voters who now identify as Republicans. You probably have seen Robinson County. If you haven't, Google it. You've seen them in the news. There was an article just about a week ago in the American Prospect. But this county as well, Robinson County, is where the majority of the Lumbee voters are. In 2008 and 2012, they voted for Obama. In 2016 and 2020, they voted for Trump. One of the first counties in the nation that had that flip in 2016. Now, on the opposite side of that coin here in these in rural southern North Carolina, you'll see that Hispanic voters have actually stayed pretty consistently at about 40% their party registration as Democrats. They actually have shrunk quite a bit from their affiliation to the Republican Party, and then seen a nice, pretty large increase of 10 points to unaffiliated. And that, once again, is also an opportunity for us to make sure that we don't think about our Hispanic voters as a monolith, state to state or region to region. There are lots of different things that are happening in those populations. So we talked a little bit about how the party is shifting. Let's see how the rubber meets the road and how people are actually turning out to vote over these last 4 presidential cycles. So hopefully these lines kind of will tell you what the direction is from 2008 to 2020. White voters and Native American voters saw a major shift from 2008 to 2020. That was where they actually had historic voter turnout. And I always talk about the fact that in 2020, we talk about history being made and the percent of voters that turned out. It was made, but it wasn't made for everyone. So as you can see in our white voters in these rural counties and our Native American, it was a historic year. But when you look at our Black voters and our Hispanic voters, Black voters were actually running pretty neck and neck to the registered voter turnout of white voters in 2008 and 2012. We saw that major decline in 2016. We saw a promising rebound in 2020, but the white voter turnout was out of the roof at 83%. And our Hispanic over 40 voters did not see that same rebound in 2020. So once again, I don't think I mentioned this is specifically those voters over 40. So what in our world we call the older voters, I don't consider a 41-year-old old, but for the purposes of seeing these distinctions and how performance is, that's what we're calling it. Now, this chart by far is the one that is the most interesting and kind of easy to see, most concerning. These are our 18 to 40-year-old voters. And this is the population that New Rural Project has a lot of focus on. Just like the last page, you see where the green arrows are. You see where 2020 was historic. It was historic for white voters under 40, and it was historic for Native American voters under 40. But African American, Hispanic voters, their registered voter turnout fell off a cliff from 2008 to 2020. In 2008, 2012, Black voters under 40 actually had the highest voter turnout of any population, those under 40 voters. As you can see, we saw what happened in 2016, and unfortunately, we didn't see any promising change in direction. Same thing we saw with the Hispanic voters. Now, as we can see here, I'll just say briefly, Houston, we know we have a problem. And that's where the New Rural Project is coming in. You'll hear more about it next week, but I really want to end my last slide just to show you what does this mean as it relates these changes we've seen over the last 12 years in actual election results. So for those, I'm a North Carolinian, just like Rachel. So Elaine Marshall is our Secretary of State. She's a Democrat. She's been on the ballot for the last 4 presidential cycles that I just went through some numbers. This is how her results worked out over those same time frames. So if you think back to those charts I showed you, it was a lot of data. I went through them kind of quickly. In 2008 and 2012, we had a lot more people who were registered as Democrats. We had the highest voter turnout of Hispanic and African American voters. Elaine Marshall was getting over 70% of the vote. And also, I'll note, she's a statewide candidate. This is not a product of gerrymandering. She votes, these whole counties got to vote for her every one of these elections. As we saw those changes in 2016 and 2020 with dismal voter turnout for our African American younger voters, as well as even those under 40, over 40 in 2016. And we saw that shift of fewer people registering in the white and the Native American population as Democrats. Elaine Marshall squeaked by in these 5 counties and actually lost a couple of these counties that she was winning at 60%. So I know these slides are a little bit gloom and doom, but stick around, come back next week, and I'm going to tell you what New Rural Project is looking to do about these numbers. And we'll talk a little bit more in your Q&A about what we're actually hearing from these voters as we've been on the ground for why they have lost their engagement and their excitement in our political process. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to my friend Erica.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I am so glad that we met a year ago as well. And thank you to Indivisible for helping facilitate that connection. I want to ask Rachel if you would be so kind as to let people in. If there's still some latecomers coming in, I won't be able to monitor the waiting room anymore. So that would be great, Rachel. Thank you. And I also want to say I've been noticing that the chat is totally rocking with some really incredible insights. I mean, it seems like most of the people attending this could practically be giving this presentation. So we're going to definitely save that chat and make it available to you all afterwards. It's really great. Thank you for all of your comments. So Anthony has talked about how over the past 30 years or so, liberals and Democrats have come to be more oriented toward the interests of highly educated urban professionals. And what I'm going to be doing in this segment is talking about how that more elitist orientation shows up in the way that liberals talk about working class people and about rural America, flyover country, or as the Washington Post calls it, the country's dank backwaters. I'm going to begin by showing you a few examples of liberals scolding and ridiculing people that they think they're better than. And when I talk about liberal condescension, I just want to be clear that I don't want anyone here to feel blamed. What I'm doing here is showing cause and effect that I've observed, and I leave it up to each of you to reflect on whether you've played any role in this. So I'm gonna run through these examples without any commentary because I think that they speak for themselves. And as you're looking at these, try to put yourself in the shoes of the people on the receiving end. So what happens when people are treated with this kind of contempt is that they feel shame and anger, and they get defensive. Being verbally attacked triggers the same kind of fight or flight reflex that being physically attacked does. And the brain becomes preoccupied with protecting the person from getting hurt. And so the higher level regions of the brain that are responsible for empathy and reasoning shut down so that no learning is possible. The person's too busy figuring out how to get away or how to retaliate. And one way of retaliating is to stubbornly dig in your heels and deprive your attacker of the satisfaction of being persuasive. The other way of retaliating is even worse. It's revenge seeking. This is why humiliation is considered the nuclear bomb of the emotions, because the humiliated person wants to lash back tenfold or find someone who will do it for them. This is what defensive looks like. And Trump knows this. What humiliation entrepreneurs like Trump are so good at is forming an us versus them bond against people who seem to despise them. He knows that if he can make people feel vindicated instead of ashamed, that they will love him. And this is a key part of Trump's cult of personality. And it's why insulting Trump can really be a big backfire, because it makes him look like a victim, and like a victim in the eyes of the people who are also having their intelligence insulted by the same liberals. There was an article in the Atlantic about blue-collar Trump supporters, and the reporter interviewed an Ohio steelworker who was the president of his local union. And he said that he found Trump's insults exhilarating because they were a kind of revenge. And then he said this: it's a mirror of the way they see us. And I want to point out that in this picture, you'll notice that Jack is protesting a lockout at his factory. And this brings up another really big problem that I see with the habit of treating people with disdain, which is that very often it's class-based. It's punching down at working people, especially rural working people, some of whom tend to be more culturally conservative, but who can still be progressive on bread and butter issues. But when liberals get in the habit of treating them with disdain and casting them as deplorables, then this can become an excuse for not meeting their material needs and not caring if they lose their jobs or their farms or their factories. I'm sorry, their hospitals, their local hospitals, or their factories. So if we act like we don't care, then why would they vote for us? I want to show you a comment I came across from a New York Times reader that I think pretty well captures what a lot of people who aren't part of the ultra progressive left are feeling. I am an old FDR Democrat. Whenever I try to talk politics with my progressive friends and relatives, I am met with a sneering laugh, openly derisive and dismissive of anyone so stupid that they do not see the virtue of unlimited illegal immigration, questions the recent orthodoxy that there is no such thing as male and female, or tries to explain that condescending contempt is a poor way to garner votes. These are highly educated people. One is a senior professor of sociology, another a Pulitzer-winning author, another a distinguished lawyer. The laugh is always the same, as if they practice it together, a nearly hysterical giggle of embarrassment that anyone could be so stupid. I am made to feel as if I am mentally deficient, and they can't wait to change the subject, to end the embarrassment of being in the presence of a knuckle-dragging Neanderthal. Just imagine how a conservative reacts to this treatment. So this FDR Democrat is probably a swing voter, just the kind of person we need to be very careful not to needlessly antagonize, because these swing voters make or break most elections. I'm going to show you one more quote. This one's from a school teacher who was asked why she thought rural Iowa voters switched from Obama to Trump. I think maybe part of it is we feel like the liberals are telling us that if you don't believe in abortion, that you hate women. And if you like guns, then you just want kids in school killed. And so I think a lot of people felt almost attacked for beliefs that they have. And so people on the fence like myself that could go either way a lot of times feel that a lot of times liberals think that they're the moral ones and they're right. It's like if you have a stance on certain issues that you can't be a part of us because you're so wrong on this issue. You have to believe these things or you're a bad person. I see this habit of treating conservatives and moderates with scorn as a huge unforced error for Team Blue that is costing us way more voters than it's gaining us, and is fueling the polarization that keeps rural and urban America divided, and that's still keeping rural voters wanting someone like Trump back to defend their honor. A sociologist talked to laid off steelworkers in a town called Dundalk, Maryland. And he said that a lot of them were former Democrats who voted for Trump. They started getting interested in Trump as soon as Trump started talking about steel tariffs, even though they knew that tariffs probably weren't going to work. But just the fact that Trump was talking about them, it made them feel like here was a politician who was finally paying attention to them. And then he concluded, Trump's master stroke was to recognize the desperation of the white working class over the deteriorating industrial economy and to encourage their tendency to racialize that desperation. So I am going to leave it there for now. And next week, I will be back to talk about how we can get from here to here. And back to you, Anthony.
Thanks, Erica. We're done. Just close with this. So we have as much time as you all have, the time and energy for the discussion. We will open it up now and ask Rachel to help with surfacing some of the questions. Also, our colleague Cody is on the call and he can help as well. As we look forward to next week, Erica has been focused in our last section on communication and messaging, kind of the bad, ugly part of it. We want to say clearly that we will talk a lot about communication and messaging next week, but not only that, and that we will be looking at other ways that we can help to bring about the kinds of change that we think we need. And Ruby has a whole framework of talking differently, acting differently, and thinking differently, and that's what we'll be talking about. But for now, we'll stop sharing our screen if we can, and we'll go ahead and open it up to Q&A. Ciel, I guess if you would stop the screen share, that would be great.
And I'll bring myself off mute. I did try to capture a lot of the questions. Sometimes the questions spurred some fantastic conversation going on in the chat while folks were listening and looking at the slides. I think one question that kind of came up early was, why do they not see Trump as elite? I do think you touched on that at the end, Erica, but do you want to maybe just take like a broad swipe at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because like the liberal intelligentsia didn't treat Trump like one of their own. Like they scorned him. They thought he was stupid, rude, crude, boorish, unrefined, uncultured. And then I think people saw that and were like, yeah, that's what they say about us. So they identified more with him and his style and being fed up with being scorned for it. And that's why what I was talking about, how it like created that bond that people have with him.
And I would add to that, if one of the books we recommend is Stephanie Moravchik's Trump's Democrats, which is a careful look at 3 places that were historically way on the Democratic side and that turned for Trump in 2016. And one of the points she makes is exactly what Erica said, plus Trump's willingness to kind of be physically intimidating, to be kind of vile in his language, kind of crude, but always cutting through the bullshit. I mean, he's the ultimate bullshitter, of course, but he appears to always be cutting through the bullshit. And that's what a lot of folks like in a leader, whether Democrat or Republican. They want that kind of no nonsense, put aside all the niceties, let's get to the point. And, in spite of the fact that he is an elite, he's perceived as being on their side.
Anthony, I have one kind of for you in what you were speaking to early on. First, I'm going to start with kind of a comment and then a question that ties it together. So Pam says, but so many urban dwellers cannot get ahead either. And then Deborah asks, are we conflating rural with working class?
Yeah, those are both great points. So let me say that our focus is on rural because it is rural that is driving the divide. Not only rural, there's several dimensions to the divide, certainly class, race, education, there's several dimensions. But when you look at the maps and you look at the numbers, nothing predicts voting as much and nothing shows the shift away from Democrats as much as rural. So we're not minimizing the struggle of urban and suburban dwellers, whether white or people of color, but we're focused on how did this divide come about and what do we do about it? And that's why we're focused on the struggles of rural folks in that sense. In some ways, we are conflating rural and working class, and a lot of what we say does pertain also fairly well to working class folks in mid-sized towns, manufacturing towns, and even cities and suburbs. There's plenty of working class people that would also fall. But two differences. One is that in rural communities as a whole, there is the highest percentage of working class people. That is the most common occupations are in that. And the second, although we didn't get into it too deeply here, rural has some very distinguishing features. Positive, I'm a rural person, I see them. Negative as well, that make rural distinctly different. So that working folks in rural areas, though they have a lot in common with working folks in cities and suburbs, they're also distinctly different. The deep attachment to place, the strong sense of stewardship as a value of how you manage the land. So there's a lot of elements that are specifically rural, and we try to bring all of that together. So yes, a lot of overlap with the working class generally, but still some distinctions as well.
And Rachel, can I'd like to add, as we talk about, and you can see in my slides, I did talk about that switching and partisan registration, but I also showed the folks that are disappearing from voting. And I think there was one last person that talked about, one of the last comments I saw, talked about Michael, is it Poser? I'm probably butchering his name, that talks about the folks who don't vote. And what I'm seeing in the particularly those rural voters of color is kind of just a move away from the whole process, a disengagement. And that's why our organization is a lot of the focus is there. Because when you look at those numbers that I showed that talked about party registration, I think there was a question about why talk about that. Your party registration is a good predictor of how you're going to vote as well, as we talk about rural versus urban. So if you're registered in a party, it's a big chance from a probability perspective that you'll vote that way. And so what we're seeing though is just those folks, because of the disappointments, I think because of those factories closed. I'm also born and raised rural, as Anthony mentioned, and I've seen those factories close in my rural southern hometown, in my rural southern areas, and in the counties that we work with in North Carolina. And so you definitely have seen folks just be disappointed. And I think some folks use it to say, let's switch to the party that we think cares about us. And others are just like disappointing. And they say, it doesn't matter who I vote for. Nothing in my life changes. So what's the point?
As a South Georgia person, born and raised in a rural town and watched the paper mill close up and go away, I totally can relate to that. I kind of have a follow-up question there for you, Cynthia. How much does voter suppression factor into the decline that you've noticed?
I think, it was interesting because suppression can happen because you change the laws, but it also can happen because of a lot of confusion. And so I would say that's a lot of what we've seen in North Carolina is a lot of the confusion. Do we have ID? Do we not have voter ID? How often are the lines changing? I've seen people who they're like, I've lived in the same house for the last decade from 2010 to 2020, and I had 3 different congressional districts. I never moved. And so if every time you go to vote, you're voting in a different district, you can't keep up, or the rules keep changing. And, here in North Carolina, Democrats lost control of the General Assembly for the first time in like 100 years in 2010 because we didn't win in the census. Democrats didn't win in the census year. And you've seen a dramatic rollback of some of the pretty plentiful access to voting that was there prior to 2010. So there's just a lot of combinations, but a lot of people stretching the bounds of changing lines that have gone through courts for year after year, which creates just quite a bit of confusion, which is also a tool of voter suppression.
And one more question for you, Cynthia, and then I'm going to move us along. But what role does racism and white supremacy play in these trends? Obviously a huge topic, but for one, I was surprised to hear the head of conservative think tank speak about statistics on workforce mobility at a historic low, and tying it to white men feeling entitled to a job where they already live, in contrast to historic trends of the last couple of years. There's a couple of centuries. There's a lot packed into there. So open it to Cynthia, and then anyone else who wants to take a jump at it.
So one of the things I'll say also is a Southern Georgia rural born and raised, Rachel, we share that in common. We've definitely seen kind of historically, there has been leadership in these rural counties that has been white, quite frankly. The leading class, the leadership structure of those counties is rooted in that, which has a structural nature in it. And as you have seen these counties get more diverse, at the same time, you haven't seen the leadership structures change. And I think that also has created disappointment, anger, resentment, and quite frankly, disillusionment of those rural voters. One of the things that I've looked at in looking at a lot of these numbers, when you split the populations up by over 40 and under 40, over 40, a lot of these rural counts are actually still majority white. But when you look at them under 40, they're 50-50. And so that shifting of how the demographics look, in particular happening in the younger populations, has not translated to power shifts in these rural counties. And so the question is, some of it, do you flight? Is there flight? So are those folks leaving those rural places, those persons of color, because they don't see opportunity? Or also folks just get disillusioned and disappointed and they just fall out, which is a lot of what we're seeing. And so we're hoping that our organization, and we'll talk about a lot about it next week, is looking at how do we re-engage those folks and hopefully create a feeling of not despair that they kind of experience every day.
Thank you.
Rachel, while you're summoning the next question, I'll respond to one person who asked if people could be invited to join next week who are not on tonight. And the answer is yes. It would be really, really important that they watch the recording, which we'll email out to everybody and you can pass along. But I think if they don't see the first half or hear it, it'll be a little hard to just pick up in the middle. But if they do that, they can absolutely join.
And I did hear the slides will go out with that recording afterwards, so folks didn't have to struggle to try to capture pictures. And Melody, I do see your hand up. I'm going to come to you in just a minute. I got a question for Erica. I'm going to get to.
Rachel, can I just, sorry, can I say something real quick before we move on to the next question on the racism issue? Just to add on a little bit, I think that clearly, like, there is a cohort of voters both in rural and urban and suburban America that are just, they're racists, and they're happy that Trump made it safe and great to be racist again. And they're going to vote for him for that reason, and people like him for that reason. And there's nothing we can do about it. And we're not going to reach those people. Right. But I don't think there's as many people in that camp as maybe we tend to assume. And the sociologists who have really done the deep work of going into these towns and talking to people, like by and large, like white working class voters, many of whom flipped from Obama to Trump, when they did the deep conversations with them, what they were really hearing is like the economic catastrophe. Like, their towns blew up in the 2000s. And they're either looking for someone to blame, and Trump gives them all the wrong scapegoats to blame, or they're just looking for a change. They're like, well, Democrats blew it, NAFTA was horrible. We got to try something different because we're desperate and our towns are a mess now. So I think it's like really, I think the racism and the economic pain piece are really kind of inextricable in that sense, and that the more downwardly mobile a community is, the more susceptible it's going to be to the racist dog whistles.
And can I just add one thing? In terms of even that chart I showed about the Lumbee voters, because I do think that is where we're still doing, trying to understand that dramatic shift over time. But I think the other piece that was discussed is that, frankly, Trump and conservatives have shown up. So physically being there is what also made a big difference. So I'll give you an example. In the 2020 election, Lumbee voters and Lumbee folks in North Carolina have state recognition, but they don't have federal recognition, a thing they've been fighting for decades. Joe Biden actually came out first and said he would support federal recognition if he was elected president. He did it first. Donald Trump came out second. But he didn't only say he would support federal recognition, he actually held a rally in Robeson County. So his support of federal recognition trumped what Biden had said. But also the thing about these rural counties, while they might have been in one place, it felt to all rural people that he cared. Robeson County had never had a presidential visit in their history. He cemented that vote by that one visit, but it didn't only impact there, because all the local papers are carrying that he was there. So even if you might not be a Lumbee person, you're rural, look at Donald Trump. He cares about us. Even if what he's saying says the exact opposite.
I didn't realize that was had happened in that way. So you're educating me tonight too, Cynthia. This is great. From Pam, I've got a comment here I want maybe Erica to remark on. It says, but we are the moral ones. And a moment later it says, when the Republicans are always lying, we are the moral ones.
I think that it's one thing to hold your own integrity and your own set of ethics and morality, and we all do that. And it's another to say, to put yourself out there as morally superior because you hold those ethics. I mean, I think that like morality is like such a relative and deeply personal thing that we all come to as kind of the culmination of all of the experiences and education and, you know, churches we've gone to, the way we were raised, all these different things kind of culminate in us having a personal code. Everyone comes by it honestly. And so, sure, I think my morality is better than someone else's. If I thought the other person's moral code was better, I would adopt it. And they feel the same way. And if I'm trying to talk to them and have any hope of them, you know, shifting their position on an issue that I think is really important, if I come at them with, well, I'm morally superior to you because I think A and you think B, then I feel like the conversation is over before it's even started, because they're just going to be like, screw you. Like, that's just, it's like a self-righteous vibe that is very, very off-putting.
And I'd add to that, and here again is the distinction that Levison makes. His terms are extremists and cultural traditionalists, whether you buy that or not. Almost all of us who live in rural communities know that probably the majority of our neighbors are conservative, and if they weren't before, they're now Republicans. And they're good people, most of them. They show up when you're in need. They're the people that came after the tornado destroyed Glade Spring in Virginia. They're there. And so I think part of what we're trying to convey through all of this is that so long as we focus on the depravity of the Republican Party, and there's plenty more every day to see, as long as we both focus on that and use that as the characterization for essentially everybody on that side, and a huge proportion of whom are in rural areas, we've got no chance of reaching them, no chance of changing the bad trends politically and otherwise that we're seeing. If we get to know our neighbors, and we'll be talking about them next week, we'll start to see that a whole lot of them are ambivalent and torn about some of these issues, but fundamentally, they're decent human beings. And that's what we've got to accept before we can move forward and maybe look at a new way of meeting these challenges.
Thank you. That's a good add-on. Melody, I'm going to go ahead and let you unmute. You should come open. Is it letting you?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I didn't quite know the process for asking a question, and I can't read the chat. It's so tiny that, so yeah, I just think it's important to, from what I know, there's not just one monolithic working class, and that people of lower income actually did not predominantly elect Trump. It was people without college degrees with an income around 70,000, I think, who were the largest supporters. And I don't say that as just like a stereotype, but that what we have found is that, and what a lot of people have found, like Thomas Edsall, who's been looking at a lot of these statistics, is that people, the lowest income working class, are far more interested in shifting and open to conversation about voting differently. And many of them are not voting now. And I really appreciated, Cynthia, what you're talking about doing with your project and looking at how many people are not voting now. But I just like to keep that in mind, that, that what I've seen happen and I was born and raised rurally, but what I've seen happen over the past 40 years is that the Democratic Party, and also organizing, grassroots community organizing, statewide organizations in the South, pulled back from rural areas and became more urban centered. And I mean, not that that was all a bad thing, to broaden membership across the whole state, but really a lot of rural organizing has been defunded in the past couple of decades. And I think we have to support organizing with people who are facing these tremendous issues. And without that, all the messaging, I think, won't have the same kind of impact if we're not organizing together.
Oh, Melody, I couldn't agree
So-
with you more on a lot of that. Indivisible
Amen.
Rural Project, Cynthia's Rural Project, Ruby, we have got it. And we are here and
Yep.
invest. Take it, Cynthia, go.
So I 100% agree with you, Melody, 1,000%. At least, and that's the perspective that we come from, is that there has been a disinvestment in these rural communities by the progressive eco-structure. There are people there. Richmond County, which is a rural place. I had a lot of folks, I was the 9th district chair for the Democratic Party prior to running for office. There were Yang Gang folks in Richmond County. Those were young African Americans who were part of the Yang Gang, but we're not talking to them. And that's right. Part of the reason for our organization is we didn't see anyone giving attention to these rural folks of color in particular. Trump agitated and amplified folks, but they weren't rural folks of color. He amplified and made feel important, I believe, white rural voters. He wasn't speaking to, to Black and brown rural voters. He was speaking to those white rural voters. And so in the gap of no one speaking to them, either they see someone talking to rural voters anyway, whether they're saying good things that feel like it should energize them, or they just walk away. And so that's 100% what we've got to do is reinvest in touching and reaching rural voters. It's not only obviously for votes, but they are as important part of our community and our country as anyone. And our democracy will never be saved if everyone doesn't participate and we don't treat every voter just as important. And I think that's what's happened is there has been not too much, but a lot of focus on the urban side because there are lots of votes, right? But there are lots of votes sitting on the table in these rural places that we're not even trying to go get.
I hear you there. I believe we're coming up close to our time. I'd like to give y'all just a few minutes to wrap up your final thoughts. I will say we've got a document where I've kind of captured some of the questions that we didn't get to tonight, and I can decide how you want to work through those, Ruby, and I'll let you drop your links and wrap us up.
Great. So thank you all so much for a vital discussion. Next week, our presentation will be a bit shorter, so there'll be a little more time for discussion. And the focus again will be, given what we've talked about today, what do we do about it? How can we effectively begin to change things? From bringing people who've given up on both parties back into the process on our side to persuading the relatively small group, but significant number of persuadable people, especially in rural areas. That's really going to be the focus. I think we've got some good thoughts, and I know many of you are working on that very thing. So we'll welcome you back. Cynthia, Eric, and I will all be back this time next week. Feel free, please, to spread the word, once you have the recording from us in the next day or so, to share it. And we'd love to have all of you back and a few more next week. So again, thanks to all of you and thanks to Indivisible for hosting this.